Hi, I'm Dan Boyd.
And I'm Megan Gleason. Welcome to another episode of Rounding Up the Roundhouse.
If you enjoy our podcast, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us bring you more content like this. You can find this episode and all of our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, abqjournal.com, as well as YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. See the show notes for a discount code on a digital subscription. Thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading news.
It's getting quite busy. Just a little over 1 week left.
Yeah, we're getting to the point where, everyone's getting a little frantic and sleep deprived and maybe a little cranky, but we have seen a lot of progress on some key bills, some bills that are moving fast and other bills that, are a little bit stuck in committee at this point. And, some of their backers are getting a little desperate, getting a lot of story pitches and things like that but it has been, an action-packed few days here, and we're starting to see, at least some things kind of take shape with the final week coming right up here.
Yeah, and some of the big things we're watching out for, especially in this last week, are the financial bills. So we still haven't quite seen the budget make it out of Senate Finance, even though we thought maybe this week would be the week. We'll see how it goes today and maybe over the weekend. I know the House is eagerly anticipating that to come back to see what changes will be made on the Senate side of things. And this morning I was listening to a House Tax Committee meeting with this year's tax package, and I don't want to get into the details too much until I have a chance to sit down and really dig into it. But essentially, it's a proposal to create a new oil and gas tax in order to pay to expand the working families tax credit. And what this would do would allow families making $70,000 or less annually not to have to pay personal income tax. It was a pretty interesting debate, and kind of as expected, we saw a lot of questions around why do we need new taxes when we have such a booming budget and surplus, and why are we taxing an industry that provides so much of that budget, and also kind of an interesting argument of this is increasing the state's reliance on a volatile industry, which we've historically seen come from Democrats rather than Republicans. But we saw that kind of flipped, saying, we need to diversify the state's revenue sources, and this is not doing that. And then, of course, on the other side, you're seeing arguments to help out working families by eliminating that personal income tax. And I think an analyst said the median household income in New Mexico is around $55,000 a year. So quite a lot of families, they said 100,000 or more, would qualify for this.
Yeah, and we are at the point where, a lot of these bills are kind of tied into the budget. Like Megan was mentioning kind of their fiscal impact. We did a story earlier this week about a paid leave bill that's gotten a lot of attention at the Roundhouse, and it got a hearing in the Senate Finance Committee, but it wasn't a hearing that they voted on the bill. But a lot of kind of solvency questions raised about how certain provisions in that legislation would be paid for, especially some kind of baby rebates that wouldn't take effect for a few years, but there's not actually a specific funding mechanism included in the bill. So some senators raising kind of concern about, how would this be paid for? Where's this magic pot of money going to come from? And so interesting to see a little bit of that pushback between the House and the Senate sometimes on these kind of funding questions. And then until we see a final version of the budget, not knowing exactly where the final dollar amounts are going to be for some of these things that may be passed. But if they don't have an appropriation with them, then it can be kind of an unfunded mandate, which is becoming one of the, the buzzwords here of the final week at the Roundhouse.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting time, too, because you're not only seeing those kind of partisan divides, but you are also seeing the House and Senate divides, where the Senate is looking at the House and saying, why are you sending so many unfunded mandates to us? Paid family leave, formerly known as the Paid Family Medical Leave Act, being one of them. And I will note something that maybe can throw people off online when you pull up a bill and the appropriation is struck out. That doesn't necessarily mean it's unfunded. It just means that funding could have been moved to the budget. And so that's why everything is kind of up in the air right now of has your funding made it into the budget bill or not?
And I think there, as we enter these final week, there is some time elements to keep in mind too. I mean, the budget, I think the Senate holding that back might be partly intentional, to hold the cards a little bit at this stage in the process. Obviously, the budget usually doesn't pass both chambers until the final days of the session. So then the governor will have 20 days after the session to act on it. But but not kind of getting it to the governor's desk before then, where she might be able, if she was unhappy with certain things, to veto parts of it before the session ends. So I wouldn't expect to see a final vote on the budget until, kind of late in the week, sometime next week. Although we will hopefully, see it come out of the Senate Finance here in the next few days.
Yeah, and the budget is one of the few bills where the governor can go through and line item veto. And remind me, Dan, is that true for the tax package for capital outlay as well?
Well, definitely for capital outlay. The tax package is an interesting one that actually came up the other year, whether or not the governor can line item veto a tax bill. Usually it's only appropriations bills. So there was a difference in opinion, even here at the legislature among smart people about whether, but the governor did line item veto a tax package a few years ago. So, and that was not challenged in court. So still some disagreement over that, but one of those things where people might disagree, but if the governor goes ahead and does it, then it'll be a question whether anyone challenges, her on that.
Yeah, and on the topic of governor vetoes, it's something we highly anticipate is going to come up if a bill to allow local school boards, the authority to enforce however many days they want in a school year. So this is an effort that dates back a little bit, and that it came up last year of the governor saying she really wants to see at least 180 days in a school year for all schools in her public education department. After the legislature wouldn't adopt a policy around those lines, her public education department did it anyway. It got rejected in court, and now the public education department is appealing that. But in the legislature, we're seeing it come up as well with a bill that would enforce that court ruling of you can't require a minimum of 180 days through a bill that would, codify that ruling. So it's an interesting thing. The governor's office hasn't said outright that the governor would veto this, but it seems extremely likely. And the bill sponsors have also acknowledged, yeah, if this makes it to her desk, I'm not sure that it would become law, but this is kind of showing her that this is what the people want is more local school control, especially in those rural districts where you have a lot of 4-day school weeks. It can take hours for kids to actually get on the bus and get to school. On the other side of that, the governor says it's time for change. Like, the education is not doing well in New Mexico, and more time in school would help fix that.
Yeah, and sticking on the issue of vetoes, another one that we're tracking is a CYFD related bill, and I think we've talked about this on previous episodes, but this is a bill that would create a new Office of the Child Advocate outside of CYFD, actually attached to the Attorney General's office. This is a bill that's been around for a few years, but it's never quite made it through the process. This year, it passed the House without a single no vote. It passed its first Senate committee in a pretty heated hearing earlier this week that I covered. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Joseph Cervantes, basically acknowledged that in past years he'd agreed to block the bill and not let it be heard out of some pressure from past CYFD secretaries. And this year he said, he still had some concerns about the bill, but that he's just, run out of patience and thinks more needs to be done. The CYFD secretary was there in the room, told them not to pass the bill, that it would be kind of a punitive measure, but they still did pass it without any dissent. I did get to talk to the governor yesterday about it, and she didn't say specifically whether she would veto it, but she did express some concerns about the legislation and said legislators should be focusing on other issues. So that's one to keep an eye on. If it does get up to her desk, and she does veto it, depending on the timing, that's one where we, could see an override vote, which is pretty rare in New Mexico over the last, several decades.
Yeah, and along those same lines, we also have seen legislation around CARA get through. And this has to do with babies who are born exposed to substances like drugs or alcohol. It's a treatment program, and it's a referral program for parents who might be struggling with addiction. This bill would make enrolling in the program mandatory if it's applicable to families. And it would also move the program's primary authority over from CYFD to the Department of Health. And CYFD is actually on board with that bill. They say that the Department of Health has good resources to implement the program and really treat babies who are born exposed. The Republicans have been trying to get this measure through for the past 2 years, and this year it seems to have momentum. It's moving through on a pretty unanimous votes on a couple sides. You just watched that, right, Dan?
Yeah, it passed the Senate, I believe, yesterday without any debate, really. So it's really interesting to see it when one bill on a certain issue gets a lot of attention and debate, and and another bill, even if it's pretty big changes, just sails through. So that's one of those things where, behind the scenes, there may be some talks going on about, moving different bills that some could be maybe kind of used to moderate other bills, but it's interesting how sometimes one bill can get some momentum and just start moving through without even, much debate at the Roundhouse, while others kind of get bogged down in the quagmire of the third floor of the building here. So.
Yeah. And, something else that came up yesterday, it was kind of a fun day. We saw actor and producer Emilio Estevez show up at the Capitol. The governor was with him. He announced Young Guns 3, and there was quite a crowd in the rotunda. It kind of reminded you that there's still, a lot of fun things. It was Film and Media Day, and there's a lot of other things going on besides policy making in the Roundhouse. There are still some pretty jovial events.
Yeah, and I mean, it is kind of that time of the session where it's all hands on deck, but it's also a lot of lobbying going on. People were kind of frantically trying to get legislators to advance their bills. I did just want to throw in a few numbers. We're now up to 7 bills having passed both chambers as of today. So I would expect to see that number, go up by at least 100 or more bills probably by the time adjournment next Saturday. But we did see a few bills get through both chambers that are headed to the governor's desk. That includes one bill kind of modernizing the state Department of Game and Fish and revising the Game Commission, and that'll be an interesting one to see if the governor signs off on that. She's vetoed kind of similar legislation in the past, so I think you listened into the concurrence vote last night in the Senate on that, and they did ultimately end up agreeing barely, I guess, to the House's changes on that bill.
Yeah, it was a party line vote over there, and we actually even saw one of the Republican bill sponsors not agree to the changes the House made, and the House had kind of adjusted some language in the bill. There was a lot of cleanup, and there was some confusion over. It was a very long concurrence thing, but they adjusted some licensing fees and kind of specified some legal action, but the changes were not quite as lengthy as they did seem. But it was a late discussion. It was actually kind of an interesting one too in the Senate last night when gun-related legislation came up after that concurrence had passed, and there was a call of the House that they couldn't complete, and it was coming up on 10 p.m. They did other legislation, still couldn't complete it, so they decided to just roll the bill over until they could complete the call of the House. So we are seeing those, everybody needs to be around to get stuff done now.
And it seems, there's another gun bill that's gotten a lot of attention, an assault weapon ban, and that bill has been in Senate Finance, hasn't gotten a hearing. I know advocates are getting anxious and impatient on that. I think there's a protest planned for tomorrow at the Roundhouse. So it's interesting to see that bill, maybe looking like it's facing a tougher path to approval. But then another legislation, that other bill you mentioned, maybe being one that sounds like it does have a chance to get through. And we'll be interested to see what other kind of procedural moves Republicans might try to use to block that. I know at a news conference this week, we talked to House Minority Leader Gail Armstrong, and she kind of acknowledged that at this point, time is a weapon that they have. I mean, they can kind of filibuster or use the 3-hour debates in the House to try to block bills from advancing. And even House Speaker Javier Martinez said Democrats did the same thing when they were the minority. So it's not it's using the rules to your advantage, but it also means for leadership on the Democratic side, really needing to decide which bills do they prioritize, knowing that they probably can't get all of them through at this point.
Yeah, and I've been watching the House a lot this year, and they are going very long on every single bills that you wouldn't expect to turn into 1, 2, 3-hour debates are ended up being debated quite a long time. And I think even in some cases the Democrats are kind of turning the tables, and with the Republicans speaking up for 3 hours about some Democrat bills, we're seeing Democrats do the same for Republican bills. It seems like people are getting a little fed up, and yeah, it's interesting. It'll be interesting. And on the topic of things getting held up in important committees, we're seeing medical malpractice changes come up again tonight, which is something I know we've talked about a lot. They had started discussing it last time. They didn't get to vote on it. It's first on the agenda this afternoon, and we'll see what comes of that. So, unlikely to pass at this point. It's got 2 more committee assignments if it gets through the Senate committee, and then the Senate and the House. And yeah, it's just not a good sign if you're not on the floors yet, or even on the other side of the Roundhouse. It's going to be a tough battle.
Yeah, and our colleague Kathy Cook has been tracking that bill, and we'll probably have a story later today, depending on if they do vote on it. So we'll definitely keep an eye out for that. For anyone wondering, the other 2 bills, I mentioned that 7 bills have passed. A tribal regalia at school events like graduations, things like that. That bill was passed, going to the governor's desk. Also, a bill dealing with property tax exemptions for veterans is going to the governor's desk, and that came after a constitutional amendment was approved last year by voters. So, one last bill that I would plug here before we say bye is one dealing with psilocybin, using mushrooms for kind of medical purposes. This is something that I think Oregon has a program, but not many other states have done it. And we weren't sure how the bill would fare this year, but it passed the Senate on a 33-4 vote earlier this week. I was really intrigued. Some veterans who have shown up and testified on the bill, and really the impact that this treatment has had for them, kind of dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. And we'll see if that bill gets through the House, but does seem to have some momentum, and certainly could be an interesting thing to keep an eye on moving forward.
Yeah, and keep an eye out in the regular paper and at abqjournal.com for our stories. It's hard to summarize everything in such a short time frame, so we definitely will be following up with longer stories explaining some of these issues more in depth.
Yeah, no, we probably need to go make sure we're not missing anything here at the Roundhouse, Megan, but we appreciate everyone following in. We'll try to have another episode for you kind of early next week as we enter the final kind of home stretch of this session. But yeah, keep an eye out for our stories at abqjournal.com, also social media, and of course, if anyone who still subscribes to the print version, we appreciate you too.
Yeah, and remember, you can find these podcasts on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. But otherwise, we'll see you soon. I'm sure Dan and I are going to be very busy over the weekend, but if you can squeeze wrist and do it.
8 days to go. Thanks for listening.